Hello, today is Friday, May 30th. Welcome to episode 458 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI's Deputy Executive Director, Martha Miller, and I'm joined today by NSI Senior Fellows Matt Hayden and Amy Mitchell, and NSI Fellow Jessica Jones. The rhetoric around the Ukraine war has hit a fever pitch this week. President Trump, signaling frustration, issued an apparent 2-week deadline to Vladimir Putin just a few days ago, warning that he'll know if the Russian leader is just tapping us along and threatening a different response. This ultimatum follows Russia unleashing one of its largest offensives and deadliest bombardments of the war, with hundreds of missiles and drones hitting Kyiv and other cities, resulting in a dozen deaths, civilians, of course, being killed. These devastating attacks occurred despite a recent Trump-Putin call where a Russian peace memorandum was promised but has not surfaced. As Russia advances on new fronts, including Sumy, and Ukraine scrambles to defend and with reports of its own successful long-range drone strikes deep into Russian territory, the diplomatic front is equally charged. Trump has labeled Putin as absolutely crazy, while Russian officials have dismissed his criticisms as emotional and uninformed, with Medvedev issuing a veiled nuclear warning. Meanwhile, reports this week confirm extensive North Korean military aid with millions of artillery shells and even troops, significantly bolstering Moscow's war machine. So talks have been proposed for Istanbul, just like they had been for the Vatican, but Russia is still insisting on maximalist demands. So let's get into it. Amy, I'd like to start with you. A few weeks ago, we talked about the Vatican. At that time, the Pope had raised the possibility of having talks at the Vatican. So here we are again. There's talk about Istanbul. Is peace feasible? What conditions would set the scene for peace?
So I think going back, and we've said and talked about this multiple times on this podcast, there is no reason for Putin to negotiate here. He holds the land, he holds the nuclear warheads, he holds the threats. And so unless we are willing to take on an escalatory approach where we call his bluff, as the president would say, and I've said this before, Putin holds the cards, not the U.S. And that was the same problem that we saw during the Biden administration. They were constantly trying to maneuver to just stave off any escalation. The President Trump has come in, said that he could solve this. Obviously, it's not as simple as everyone, as he perceived it to be. Peace takes two partners to be able to achieve. And we are now back at the same position that we were even a year ago. But I would say at this point, Putin is actually in a stronger position today than he was a year ago, where the U.S. was kind of bolstering Europe and Ukraine and setting up this wall around Ukraine where Putin didn't feel comfortable kind of going forward. Now he's talking about taking all of Ukraine. And so, again, as we've talked about before, Europe really needs to get serious and talk about their defense spending, what they're willing to risk on this. And the U.S. has to come up with a strategy, which Trump accused Biden of not having, of how to actually deal with this situation long term. Putin's not going anywhere.
Jess, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about, Trump's posture towards Putin and Russia. Does Trump mean what he says? And, what does this deadline mean?
I think that's a great question. And to Amy's point, we could probably put our talking points on a track and loop them for some of these episodes because we see the same recurring issues. We have another ultimatum here. I will say that President Trump seems more disillusioned with Putin now than we've seen previously, at least publicly, right? He's really kind of lashed out on social media and saying that there's going to be consequences, and it's our 2-week ultimatum. But you have to, we've talked about the carrot and the stick. There has to be a stick at the end of some of this to actually know that the president has leverage. And what does the Kremlin do in response? They start mocking President Trump on social media as well. State officials and state accounts are, you point out, call them, emotional, underinformed. They've threatened World War III. They've joked about him changing his position tomorrow, which we can dismiss here, kind of, that is Russian rhetoric. But that might have audiences across the world, right? There's a global audience. There's the global South. There's a lot of important countries out there that are listening or following these accounts. And they may hold some sway because the Russian media is doing this to paint the White House and the Trump administration as unreliable, as, to your point, ill-informed. And they might get buy-in from some other global audiences. On the positive side, with Trump being, it seems pretty angry at Putin right now, at least from what we see, we might see some change in U.S. policy, whether that's sanctions, which we know Congress is trying to move forward on, or we saw an announcement in Germany. Zelensky was in Germany that the U.S., U.K., and France and Germany have approved the striking of targets within Russia, deep within Russia. That can signal a change. Unfortunately, we've seen Russia, accounts also say that Berlin might be a target next, right, in response. So that there might be an escalation, but there seems to be, I don't think it's a 2-week ultimatum. President Trump gave an ultimatum to the Iranians to get a deal done in 2 months. He said that in March. We're nearing June 1st, and we don't have a deal yet. So I don't think it's quite an ultimatum, but I think we may see some changes in what in U.S. policy.
Matt, what do you think? Do you think this 2-week deadline means something? And if Putin does not change in this 2-week time frame, what can Trump do? And do you think the Trump administration's strategy is shifting?
The Trump administration was coming in to a position of the previous administration's pressure wasn't enough, or their decision-making wasn't sufficient to keep this from happening in the first place. So therefore, our new renewed strength through power and peace will derive this peaceful moment. It still has its legs. It still has its chance. The problem is that the Russians are going to stress test that until pressure is applied. So they're going to allow for the rhetoric game to play out as long as they want. They look at the hourglass and they say, okay, there's 4 years of this. If we tinker through one of them, that's one less year of whatever they're going to do to us. So there is this delay technique that is a Russian methodology that's part of their playbook. What we're seeing from the president now is that he's hoped that they would come to the table with a clear ideal to candidly knock it off. He didn't have a strategic objective that was absolute peace that restored full Ukrainian territory. He had people stop dying. And so in an effort to get people to stop dying and to have that conflict cease to be live kinetics, there was an approach that Russia would come to the table with that as a carrot versus the maximum pressure as a stick. So now we're seeing that wasn't sufficient, or at least it hasn't played itself out that way. And so now you have an element of tariffs, oil sanctions, elements of economic policy, as well as diplomatic levers that are going to start to get pulled if progress isn't made that isn't rhetoric from this perspective. And there is also a balance in this administration's mind that a stronger Europe, improving their defensibility and their investment in national defense infrastructure and capability is not a bad thing. Having America be the token world police that invests their capital in everything, even with partners at a reduced rate, is not a future that this administration wants to see. So the threat of a Russian saber rattling actually improves the European posture, even at a time where it looks like the U.S. is pulling back. That's still an objective that is a positive for this administration because it shows a reinvestment in their own security forces and their own security posture that the U.S. can complement at a time of its needing. So there is some positives on the edges of this, but it does mean in 2 weeks we're likely to see diplomatic sanctions as well as economic sanctions all over the place if there isn't true meaningful progress in this area.
Great. Well, we shall see. We will revisit this in 2 weeks. I think we will have to. And we will see what our predictions, if our predictions are correct, and if this just continues like a soap opera, kind of as the world turns, and the rhetoric versus action, and what actually happens in reality. So on that note, that's a wrap. Thanks so much to Kelly Crowley, Taylor Lane, Claude Jennings, and the NSI staff for their help producing today's episode. And join us on Monday, June 2nd for another episode. We are on YouTube, so please watch us. And if you like what you see or listen or hear, please rate, review, and subscribe.